Hi everybody, so we're going to read the second section of The Tiger Rising. We're starting with chapter 9. I hope you enjoyed the first session. We left off, let's see. Oh, Rob had his dream of seeing the tiger with Sistine on the tiger's back. All right, so chapter 9, here we go. His father woke him up at 5:30 the next morning. "Come on, son," he said, shaking Rob's shoulder. "Come on, you're a working man now. You gotta get up." He took his hand away and stood over Rob for a minute more. Then he left. Rob heard the door to the motel room squeak open. He opened his eyes. The world was dark. The only light came from the falling Kentucky Star. Rob turned over in bed and pulled back the curtain and looked out the window at the sign. It was like having his own personal shooting star, but he didn't ever make a wish on it. He was afraid that if he started wishing, he might not be able to stop. In his suitcase of not thoughts, there were also not wishes. He kept the lid closed on them, too. Rob leaned on his elbow and stared at the star and listened to the rain gently drumming its fingers on the roof. There was a warm, glowing kind of feeling in his stomach, a feeling that he wasn't used to. It took a minute to name it. The tiger. The tiger was out there. He got out of bed and put on shorts and a t-shirt. "Still hot," his father said when Rob stepped out the door. "And still raining." "Uh-huh," said Rob, rubbing his eyes. "Yes, sir. If it don't stop soon, the whole state's ain't gonna be nothing but one big swamp." "Oh, the rain doesn't bother me," Rob muttered. On the day of his mother's funeral, it had been so sunshiny that it hurt his eyes, and after the funeral, he and his father had to stand outside in the hot, bright light and shake everybody's hand. Some of the ladies hugged Rob, pulling him to them in jerky, desperate movements, smashing his head against their bodies. If you don't look just like her, they would tell him, rocking him back and forth and holding on to him tight. Or they would say, "You got your mama's hair, that cobwebby blonde," and they ran their fingers through his hair and patted his head like he was a dog. And every time Rob's father extended his hand to somebody else, Rob saw the ripped place on his suit where it had split open when he slapped Rob to make him stop crying. And it reminded Rob again, do not cry, do not cry. That was what the sun made him think of, the funeral. And so he didn't care if he ever saw the sun again. He didn't care if the whole state did turn into a swamp. His father stood up and went back into the motel room and got himself a cup of coffee and brought it outside. The steam rose off of it and curled into the air. "Now that I'm a working man," Rob said shyly, "could I drink some coffee?" His father smiled at him. "Well," he said, "I guess that'd be all right." Rob went inside and poured himself a mug of coffee and brought it back outside and sat down next to his father and sipped it slowly. It tasted hot and dark and bitter. He liked it. "All right," his father said after about 10 minutes. "It's time to get to work." He stood up. It wasn't even 6 o'clock. As they walked together alongside the back of the motel to the maintenance shed, his father started to whistle Mining for Gold. It was a sad song he used to sing with Rob's mother. Her high, sweet voice had gone swooping over his father's deep one, like a small bird flying over the solid world. His father must have remembered, too, because he stopped halfway through the song and shook his head and cursed softly under his breath. Rob let his father walk ahead of him. He slowed down and stared into the woods, wanting to see some small part of the tiger, a flick of his tail or the glow from his eyes, but there was nothing to see except for rain and darkness. "Come on, son," his father said, his voice hard, and Rob hurried to catch up. Chapter 10. Rob was sweeping the laundry room when Willie Mae, the Kentucky Star's housekeeper, came in and threw herself down in one of the metal chairs that were lined up against the cement block wall. "You know what?" she said to Rob. "No, ma'am," said Rob. "I'll tell you what," said Willie Mae. She reached up and adjusted the butterfly clip in her thick black hair. "I'd rather be sweeping up after some pigs in a barn than cleaning up after the people in this place. Pigs at least give you some respect." Rob leaned on his broom and stared at Willie Mae. He liked looking at her. Her face was smooth and dark, like a beautiful piece of wood, and Rob liked to think that if he had been the one who carved Willie Mae, he would have made her just the way she was, with her long nose and high cheekbones and slanted eyes. "What you staring at?" Willie Mae asked. Her eyes narrowed. "What you doing out of school?" Rob shrugged. "I don't know," he said. "What do you mean you don't know?" Rob shrugged again. "Don't be moving your shoulders up and down in front of me, acting like some skinny old bird trying to fly away. You want to end up cleaning motel rooms for a living?" Rob shook his head. That's right. Ain't nobody want this job. I'm the only fool Beauchamp can pay for it. You gotta stay in school, she said, else you'll end up like me. She shook her head and reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a single cigarette and 2 sticks of 8-ball licorice gum. She put one piece of gum in her mouth and handed the other one to Rob, lit her cigarette, leaned back in the chair and closed her eyes. Now, she said, the scent of smoke and licorice slowly filling the laundry room. Go on, you tell me why you ain't in school. On account of my legs being all broke out, said Rob. Willie Mae opened her eyes and looked over the top of her glasses at Rob's legs. She said after a minute. How long you had that? About 6 months, said Rob. I can tell you how to cure it, said Willie Mae, pointing with her cigarette towards his legs. I can tell you right now, you don't need no doctor. Said Rob. He stopped chewing his gum and held his breath. What if Willie Mae healed him and then he would have to go back to school? Sadness, said Willie Mae, closing her eyes and nodding her head. You keeping all that sadness down low, down in your legs. You're not letting it get up to your heart where it belongs. You gotta let that sadness rise on up. Oh, said Rob. He let his breath out. He was relieved. Willie Mae was wrong. She couldn't cure him. The principal thinks it's contagious, he said. Man ain't got no sense, Willie Mae said. He's got a lot of certificates, Rob offered. They're all framed and hung up on his wall. I bet he ain't got no certificate for common sense, though, said Willie Mae darkly. She rose up out of her chair and stretched. I gotta go clean some rooms, she said. You ain't gonna forget what I told you about your legs, are ya? No, ma'am, said Rob. Well, what'd I tell you then? She said, towering over him. Willie Mae was tall, the tallest person Rob had ever seen. To let the sadness rise, Rob said. He repeated the words as if it were part of a poem. He gave them a certain rhythm, the way Willie Mae had said them to him. That's right, said Willie Mae. You got to let that sadness rise right on up. She left the room in a swirl of licorice and smoke. After she was gone, Rob wished that he had told her about the tiger. He felt a sudden, desperate need to tell somebody who wouldn't doubt him, somebody who was capable of believing in tigers. Chapter 11. That afternoon, Rob was out in front of the Kentucky Star, weeding between the cracks in the sidewalk when the school bus rumbled up. Hey! He heard Norton Threemonger yell. Rob didn't look up. He concentrated on the weeds. Hey, disease boy! Norton shouted. We know what you got. It's called leprosy. Yeah, Billy shouted. Leprosy. All of your body parts are going to fall off. They're going to rot off, Norton yelled. Yeah, Billy screamed. That's what I meant. They're going to rot off. Rob stared at the sidewalk and imagined the tiger eating Norton and Billy Threemonger and then spitting out their bones. Hey, Norton shouted. Here comes your girlfriend, disease boy. The bus coughed and sputtered and finally roared away. Rob looked up. Sistine was walking toward him. She was wearing a lime green dress. As she got closer, he could see that it was torn and dirty. I brought your homework, she said. She held out a red notebook stuffed full of papers. The knuckles on her hand were bleeding. Thank you, said Rob. He took the notebook. He was determined to say nothing else to her. He was determined to keep his words inside himself, where they belonged. Sistine stared past him at the motel. It was an ugly 2-story building, squat and small, composed entirely of cement block. The doors of each room were painted a different color, pink or blue or green, and there was a chair, painted in a matching color, sitting in front of each door. Why is this place called the Kentucky Star? Sistine asked. Because, said Rob. It was the shortest answer he could think of. Because why? She said. Rob sighed. Because Beauchamp, the man who owns it, he had a horse once called the Kentucky Star. Well, said Sistine, it's a dumb name for a hotel in Florida. Rob shrugged. It started to rain. Sistine stood in front of him and continued to stare. She looked at the motel and then over at the blinking Kentucky Star sign, and then she looked back at him, as if it were all a math equation she was trying to come out right in her head. The rain made her hair stick to her scalp. It made her dress droopy. Rob looked at her small, pinched face and her bleeding knuckles and dark eyes, and he felt something inside of him open up. It was the same way he felt when he had picked up a piece of wood and started working on it, not knowing what it would be and then watching it turn into something he recognized. He took a breath. He opened his mouth and let the words fall out. I know where there's a tiger. Sistine stood in the drizzly rain and stared at him, her eyes black and fierce. She didn't say, "A real one?" She didn't say, "Are you crazy?" She didn't say, "Well, you're a big old liar." She said one word. "Where?" And Rob knew then that he had picked the right person to tell. Chapter 12. "We gotta go walk through the woods," Rob said. He looked doubtfully at Sistine's bright dress and shiny black shoes. "You can give me some of your clothes to wear," she told him. "I hate this dress anyway." And so he took her to the motel room, and there Sistine stood and stared at the unmade beds and the tattered recliner. Her eyes moved over his father's gun case and then went to the macaroni pan from the night before, still sitting on the hot plate. She looked at it all the same way she had looked at the Kentucky Star sign in the motel and him, like she was trying to add it all up in her head. And then she saw his carvings, the little wooden village of odd things that he had made. He had them all on a TV dinner tray beside his bed. Oh, she said. Her voice sounded different, lighter. "Where did you get those?" She went and bent over the tray and studied the carvings, the blue jay and the pine tree and the Kentucky Star sign and the one that he was particularly proud of, his father's right foot. Life-size and accurate right down to the little toe. She picked them up one by one and then placed them back down carefully. "Where'd you get them?" she asked again. "I made 'em," said Rob. She didn't doubt him, as some people would. Instead, she said, "Michelangelo, the man who painted the Sistine ceiling, he sculpted too. You're a sculptor," she said. "You're an artist." "Nah," said Rob. He shook his head. He felt a hot wave of embarrassment and joy roll over him. It lit his rash on fire. He bent and rubbed his hands down his legs, trying to calm them. When he straightened back up, he saw that Sistine had picked up the carving of her. He had left it lying on his bed, instead of intending to work on it again in the evening. He held his breath as he stared at the piece of wood. It looked so much like her, with her skinny legs and small eyes and defiant stance, that he was certain she would be angry. But once again she surprised him. "Oh," she said, her voice full of wonder. "It's perfect. It's like looking in a little wooden mirror." She stared at it for a minute more and then carefully laid it back on his bed. "Give me some clothes," she said, "and we'll go see the tiger." He gave her a pair of pants and a t-shirt and left the room and went outside to wait for her. It was still raining, but not hard. He looked at the falling Kentucky Star. He thought for a minute about one of the not wishes that he had buried deepest. A friend. He stared at the star and felt the hope and need and fear course through him in a hot neon arc. He shook his head. "Nah," he said to the Kentucky Star. "Nah." And then he sighed and stuck his legs out into the rain, hoping to cool them off, hoping to get some small amount of relief. Chapter 13. They walked together through the scrub. The rain had stopped, but the whole world was wet. The pines and the palmettos and the sad cluster of dead orange trees all dripped water. "This is where my mother grew up," Sistine said, swinging her arms wide as she walked. "Right here in Lister. She always said that she always told herself she would never come back again if she ever made it out of here. But now she's back, because my father left with his secretary, whose name was Bridget, and she can't even type, which is a really bad thing for a secretary not to be able to do. And my mother left my dad when she found that out. He's coming down here to get me. Soon. Next week, probably. And then I'm going to live with him. I'm not staying here, that's for sure." Rob felt a familiar loneliness rise up and drape its arm over his shoulder. She wasn't staying. There was no point in wishing. The suitcase needed to stay closed. He stared at Sistine's shiny shoes and willed his sadness to go away. "Ain't you worried about messing up your shoes?" he asked her. "No," she said. "I hate these shoes. I hate every piece of clothing that my mother makes me wear. Does your mother live with you?" Rob shook his head. "No," he said. "Where is she?" Rob shrugged his shoulders. "My mother's going to open up a store downtown. It's going to be an art store. She's going to bring some culture to the area. She could sell some of your wood sculptures." They ain't sculptures," Rob protested. "They're just whittling, that's all. And we got to be quiet because Beauchamp doesn't want people walking around on his land." "Is this his land?" Sistine asked. "Everything's his," said Rob. "The motel and the woods." "He can't own everything," Sistine argued. "Besides," she said, "I don't care. He can catch us and he can put us in jail for trespassing. I don't care." "Well, if we're in jail, we won't get to see the tiger," said Rob. "Where's your mother?" Sistine demanded suddenly. She stopped walking and she stared at him. "Shh," said Rob. "You gotta be quiet." He kept walking. "I do not have to be quiet," Sistine called after him. "I want to know where your mother is." He turned around and looked at her. Her hands were on her hips. Her black eyes were narrowed. "I don't want to see your dumb tiger," she shouted. "I don't care about it. You don't know how to talk to people. I told you about my father and my mother and Bridget, and you didn't say anything. You won't even tell me about your mother." Keeping her hands on her hips, she turned around and started marching back in the direction of the Kentucky Star. "Keep your dumb secrets," she shouted. "Keep your dumb tiger, too. I don't even care." Rob watched her. Because she was wearing his jeans and his t-shirt, it was like looking into a funhouse mirror. It was like watching himself walk away. He shrugged and bent to scratch his legs. He told himself that he didn't care. He told himself that she was leaving soon anyway. But when he looked up and saw her getting smaller and smaller, it reminded him of his dream. He remembered Sistine riding into the woods on the back of the tiger, and suddenly he couldn't bear the thought of watching her disappear again. "Wait up!" he shouted. "Wait up!" And he started to run toward her. Sistine turned and stopped. She waited for him with her hands on her hips. "Well?" she said when he got close to her. "She's dead," he said. The words came out in short, ragged gasps. "My mama's dead." "Okay," said Sistine. She gave a quick, professional nod of her head. She stepped toward him, and Rob turned. And together they walked back in the other direction, back toward the tiger. Chapter 14. The cage was made out of rusted chain-link fence. There was a wood board that served as a roof, and there was a chain-link door that was locked tight with 3 padlocks. Inside the cage, the tiger was still pacing back and forth, just as it had been the last time Rob saw him, as if he had never stopped pacing, or as if Rob had never gone away. "Oh," said Sistine in the same voice that she had used when she saw Rob's carvings. "He's beautiful." "Don't get too close," Rob ordered. "He might not like it if you stand too close." But the tiger ignored them. He concentrated on pacing. He was so enormous and bright that it was hard not to look directly at him. That it was hard to look directly at him. "It's just like the poem says," Sistine breathed. "What?" said Rob. "That poem. The one that goes, 'Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night.' That poem. It's just like that. He burns bright." "Oh," Rob nodded. He liked the fierce and beautiful way the words sounded. Just as he was getting ready to ask Sistine to say them again, she whirled around and faced him. "What's he doing way out here?" she demanded. Rob shrugged. "I don't know," he said. "He's Beauchamp's, I guess." "Beauchamp's what?" said Sistine. "His pet?" "I don't know," said Rob. "I just like looking at him. Maybe Beauchamp's does too. Maybe he just likes to come out here and look at him." "Well, that's selfish," said Sistine. Rob shrugged. "This isn't right for a tiger to be in the cage. It's just not right." "Well, we can't do nothing about it," Rob said. "We could let him go," said Sistine. "We could set him free." She put her hands on her hips. It was a gesture that Rob had already come to recognize and be wary of. "We can't," he said. "There's all them locks. We could saw through 'em." "Nah," said Rob. The mere thought of letting the tiger go made his legs itch like crazy. "We have to set him free," Sistine said. Her voice was loud and certain. "Nuh-uh," said Rob. "It ain't our tiger to let go." "It's our tiger to save," Sistine said fiercely. The tiger stopped pacing. He pricked his ears back and forth, looking somewhere past Sistine and Rob. "Shh," said Rob. The tiger cocked his head. All 3 of them listened. "It's a car," said Rob. "A car's coming. It's Beauchamp. We gotta go. Come on." He grabbed her hand and pulled her into the woods. She ran with him. She let him hold onto her hand. It was an impossibly small and bony hand, as delicate as the skeleton of a baby bird. They ran together, and Rob felt his heart move inside him. Not from fear or exertion, but from something else. It was as if his soul had grown and was pushing everything up higher in his body. It was an oddly familiar feeling, but he couldn't remember what it was called. "Is he behind us?" Sistine asked breathlessly. Rob shrugged. It was hard to move his shoulders up and down and keep hold of Sistine's hand at the same time. Sistine said, "Stop shrugging your shoulders at me. I hate that. I hate the way you shrug all the time." And that made Rob remember Willie May saying that when he shrugged, he looked like a skinny bird trying to fly. It struck him as kind of funny now. He laughed out loud at the thought of it. And without asking him what he was laughing about, without dropping his hand, without stopping, Sistine laughed too. Then Rob remembered the name of the feeling that was pushing up inside him, filling him full to overflowing. It was happiness. That was what that was called. Little side note, remember in Holes, Stanley has a similar experience where he can't identify the feeling that he's having, and I think his feeling was also happiness. Interesting. Chapter 15. By the time they made it back to the motel parking lot, it was dark outside, and they were both laughing so hard they could barely walk. "Rob?" said his father. He was standing at the door to their room. The blue-gray light from inside seeped out around him. "Yes, sir," said Rob. He dropped Sistine's hand. He stood up straight. "Where have you been?" "Out in the woods." "Did you finish up all them jobs I told you to do?" "Yes, sir," said Rob. "Who you got with you?" his father said, squinting into the darkness. Sistine drew herself up tall. This is Sistine," said Rob. "Uh-huh," said his father, still squinting. "You live around here?" he asked. "For now," said Sistine. "Your parents know you're here?" "I was going to call my mother," said Sistine. "There's a payphone down in the laundry room," said Rob's father. "In the laundry room?" Sistine repeated, her voice full of disbelief. She put her hands on her hips. "We don't got a phone in the room," Rob said to her softly. "Well, good grief," said Sistine. "Well, can I have some change at least?" Rob's father reached out into his pants pocket and pulled out a handful of coins. He balanced the money in the palm of his hand as if he were preparing to do a magic trick, and Rob stepped forward and took the coins from him and handed them to Sistine. "Do you want me to go with you?" he asked. "No," she said. "I'll find it. Thank you very much." "Rob," his father said as Sistine marched away, swinging her arms, "what's that girl doing in your clothes?" "She had on a dress," Rob said. "It was too pretty to wear out in the woods." "Come on in here," his father commanded. "Let's get that medicine onto your legs." "Yes, sir," said Rob. He walked toward the room slowly. His happiness had evaporated. His legs itched. And the motel room, he knew, would be as dark as a cave, it lit only by the gray light of the TV. When his mother was alive, the world had seemed full of light. The Christmas before she died, she had strung the outside of their house in Jacksonville with hundreds of white lights. Every night the house lit up like a constellation, and they were all inside of it together, the three of them, and they were happy. Rob remembered, and as he remembered, he stepped into the motel room. He shook his head and scolded himself for opening up his suitcase. Just thinking about all the things that were gone now seemed to make the darkness darker. I think I'm doing one more chapter. Chapter 16, yeah. Rob sat out on the curb in front of the motel room and waited for Sistine to come back from using the phone. He had her green dress wrapped up in a grocery bag. He had tried to fold the dress up neatly, but folding a dress turned out to be an impossible task, and he finally gave up. Now he held the bag out and away from him so that the grease from the medicine on his legs wouldn't stain it. He was relieved when Sistine finally walked toward him out of the darkness. "Hey," he said. "Hi." She sat down on the steps next to him. "How come you don't have a phone?" Rob shrugged. "Ain't got nobody to call, I guess." "My mother's coming to get me," Sistine said. Rob nodded. "Here's your dress." He handed her the bag. Sistine took it and then tilted her head to look up at the sky. Rob looked up too. The clouds had shifted and there were clear patches where the stars shone through. "I can see the Big Dipper," Sistine said. "I like looking up at things. So do my mom and dad. That's how they met. They were both looking up at the ceiling in the Sistine Chapel, and they weren't watching where they were going, and they bumped into each other. That's why I'm named Sistine." "I like your name," said Rob shyly. "I've seen the Sistine ceiling, too," she said. "They took me last year, before Bridget, when they were still in love." "Does it look like the pictures?" Rob asked. "Better," said Sistine. "It's like, I don't know, it's like looking at fireworks, kind of." "Oh," Rob said. "Maybe we could go to Italy sometime and I could show you." "That'd be all right," said Rob. He smiled into the darkness. "That tiger can't look up at the stars," said Sistine, her voice getting hard. "He's got that piece of wood over his head. He can't look up at all. We've got to let him go." Rob was silent. He was hoping that if he didn't answer her, she might go back to talking about the Sistine ceiling. "How'd your mother die?" she asked suddenly. Rob sighed. He knew there was no point in trying not to answer. "Cancer," he said. What was her name? I ain't supposed to talk about her, said Rob, closing his eyes to the stars and concentrating instead on his suitcase, working to keep it closed. Why not? Asked Sistine. Because my dad says it don't do no good to talk about her. He says she's gone and she ain't coming back, and that's why we moved here from Jacksonville, because nobody else wants to talk about her. We moved down... No, sorry, because everybody always wanted to talk about her. We moved down here to get on with things. There was a crunch of gravel. Rob opened his eyes in time to see the headlights of a car swooping over them. That's my mother, said Sistine. She stood up. Quick, she said. Tell me your mother's name. Rob shook his head. Say it, she demanded. Caroline, Rob said softly, cracking his suitcase open and letting the word slip out. Sistine gave him another businesslike nod of her head. Okay, she said. I'll come back tomorrow and we'll make our plans to let the tiger go. Sissy, called a voice. Baby, what in the world? What in the world are you doing out here? Sistine's mother got out of the car and came walking toward them. She had on high heels and she wobbled as she walked in the gravel parking lot of the Kentucky Star. Her hair was a lighter shade of yellow than Sistine's and piled up high. When she turned her head, Rob recognized Sistine's profile, her sharp chin and pointed nose, but the mouth was different, tighter. Good gracious, said Mrs. Bailey to Sistine. What have you got on? Clothes, said Sistine. Sissy, you look like a hobo. Get in the car. She tapped her high-heeled foot on the gravel. Sistine didn't move. She stood beside Rob. Well, said her mother when Sistine didn't move. You must be Rob. What's your last name, Rob? Horton, said Rob. Horton, said Mrs. Bailey. Horton. You related to Sheldon Horton, the congressman? No, ma'am, said Rob. I don't think so. Mrs. Bailey's eyes flicked away from him and back to Sistine. Baby, said Mrs. Bailey, please get in the car. When Sistine still didn't move, Mrs. Bailey sighed and looked back at Rob again. She won't listen to a word I say, Mrs. Bailey told him. Her father's the only one she'll listen to. And then under her breath she muttered, her father the liar. Sistine growled somewhere deep in her throat and stalked to the car and got in and slammed the door. You're the liar, she shouted from the back seat of the car. You're the one who lies, said Mrs. Bailey. She shook her head and turned and walked back to the car without saying anything else to Rob. Rob watched them pull away. He could see Sistine sitting in the back seat. Her shoulders were slumped. A motel room door slammed. Somebody laughed. A dog barked once, short and high, and then stopped. And then there was silence. Caroline, Rob whispered into the darkness. Caroline, Caroline, Caroline. The word was as sweet as forbidden candy on his tongue. And that's where we will stop for today. I hope you are enjoying the story, and we'll read more later. Okay, see you later.